Billionaire's cruelest joke backfires when homeless woman touches piano. The truth will shatter your heart. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment when someone's entire world collapses? When arrogance meets truth so devastating that it changes everything forever? What if I told you that the most powerful moment in human history happened not in a palace or parliament, but in a billionaire's mansion when a homeless woman sat down at a $250,000 piano? This is the story that will haunt you for weeks. The story of Richard Blackwood, a man so wealthy he could buy entire neighborhoods just to demolish them, so cruel that he organized humiliation parties, where he destroyed people's dignity for entertainment. But on one Friday night in Beverly Hills, Richard made a mistake that would change his life forever. He invited a homeless elderly woman to play his precious Steinway piano, expecting to watch her embarrass herself in front of 120 of Los Angeles's most powerful people. He had no idea he was about to discover the most shocking truth of his life. What happened next has been shared over 50 million times worldwide. It's been called the most powerful story ever told and proof that miracles still happen. But here's what nobody tells you about this story: it gets darker before it gets lighter. Much darker. Before you read, this story will make you question everything you think you know about success, family, and what really matters in life. It will make you look at homeless people differently. It will make you call your mother. Are you ready for a story that will change how you see the world? The truth about what happened when Margaret's fingers touched those piano keys will leave you speechless. The crystal glass shattered against the Italian marble floor, its sound echoing like a gunshot through the tense silence of the salon. Richard Blackwood watched the scattered fragments at his feet, each piece reflecting the golden lights of his mansion like tiny mirrors of his broken soul. "Damn it," he roared, his voice bouncing off the silk-lined walls. $30 million for this property and they can't hire competent staff. The butler, an elderly man named Harrison who had served the family for decades, immediately approached with a broom and dustpan. His hands trembled slightly as he cleaned, not from age, but from years of enduring his master's violent outbursts. "My apologies, Mr. Blackwood," Harrison murmured. "I'll bring you another glass immediately." Richard ignored him, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Beverly Hills. The city lights stretched like a diamond carpet to the horizon, each point of light representing lives he considered insignificant compared to his own. At 60 years old, Richard Blackwood had built a real estate empire valued at $2 billion, but the price had been his humanity. His reflection in the glass showed an imposing man, perfectly styled silver hair, an $8,000 Armani suit, and gray eyes that had lost any trace of compassion decades ago. His manicured hands had never known real work. His fortune had been built on the broken dreams of evicted families, historic buildings demolished for shopping centers, and real estate speculation that had displaced entire communities. "Harrison," he called without turning around. "Have all the guests arrived for tonight's soiree?" "Yes, sir." 120 people confirmed. "The canapés are being served and the string quartet has already begun playing in the garden." Richard smiled with satisfaction. His Friday night entertainment evenings had become the most coveted social event in Los Angeles. Politicians, businessmen, Hollywood actors, and millionaire heirs competed for invitations. But Richard didn't organize these parties for friendship or social pleasure. He used them as tools, opportunities to close deals, manipulate political connections, and above all, to feed his ego by demonstrating his power over others. "Perfect," he murmured. "Tonight will be special." Harrison frowned. He knew that expression on his master's face. During his 30 years of service, he had learned to recognize when Richard was planning one of his cruel spectacles. The guests never suspected that their host saw them as puppets in his personal theater of power and humiliation. "Is there anything specific you need for tonight, sir?" Harrison asked cautiously. Richard turned, his eyes gleaming with malice that chilled the blood. "Yes. There's a special surprise I've been planning. A demonstration of what happens when people forget their place in the world." The main salon of the Blackwood mansion was a masterpiece of ostentation. The vaulted ceiling rose 12 meters high, decorated with frescoes that Richard had commissioned to copy from the Sistine Chapel. Baccarat crystal chandeliers hung like golden constellations, each valued at over $100,000. The Carrara marble floor had been imported directly from Italy, from the same quarries that had provided material for Michelangelo's David. But the true center of attention was the Steinway Model D grand piano that dominated the central space. Handcrafted in Astoria, New York, this instrument had cost $250,000 and was considered one of the finest concert pianos in the world. Its polished ebony surface reflected the lights like a black lake, and its ivory keys seemed like smiling teeth waiting to be touched. The guests moved through the salon like tropical fish in a luxury aquarium. The women wore designer dresses that cost more than a family's annual salary, their jewelry capturing and reflecting light in blinding flashes. The men wore perfectly tailored tuxedos, their Rolex and Patek Philippe watches marking the time of their privileged lives. Victoria Ashworth, wife of oil magnate Thomas Ashworth, approached Richard with a glass of Dom Perignon champagne at $500 per bottle. "Richard, darling," she purred with her artificial British accent, "once again you've exceeded all expectations. This evening is absolutely divine." "Thank you, Victoria," Richard replied, kissing her jeweled hand. "But the best is yet to come." Near the piano, Senator Michael Carrington was animatedly discussing with film director Marcus Rothstein an urban development project that would require the demolition of a historic Latino neighborhood. Their voices mixed with the crystalline laughter of socialites discussing their upcoming vacations in the Hamptons or St. Tropez. "Did you hear about Richard's new downtown development?" actress Sophia Marin was commenting to her companion. "He's going to evict 300 families to build luxury condominiums." "Brilliant," responded tech entrepreneur David Chin. "That area was completely wasted with all those poor people." Richard smiled upon hearing the conversation. For him, the evicted families weren't people with stories, dreams, and memories. They were simply obstacles to progress, numbers on a spreadsheet that needed to be eliminated to maximize profits. The champagne flowed freely, served by uniformed waiters who moved among the guests like silent ghosts. The string quartet's music provided an elegant backdrop while Los Angeles's powerful celebrated their own importance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, raising his voice to capture attention. "If you'll permit me, I have something special prepared for tonight." Conversations gradually fell silent. All eyes turned to their host, expectant. Richard enjoyed these moments, when he became the absolute center of attention, when his power over others was most evident. "As you know, I always strive to offer unique entertainment at these soirees," Richard continued, walking slowly around the piano. "Tonight, I've prepared something truly special. A demonstration of the difference between illusions and reality." Murmurs of curiosity began to spread through the salon. Victoria Ashworth moved closer, her eyes shining with malicious anticipation. She also enjoyed Richard's cruel spectacles, though she would never admit it publicly. "You see," Richard continued, his smile growing wider, "during my tours of the city, I often encounter people who have lost touch with reality. People who live in fantasies about their past, who cling to illusions of grandeur that never existed." Harrison watched from the service entrance, his stomach contracting with apprehension. He recognized his master's tone of voice, the way he savored each word like a predator playing with its prey. "Tonight," Richard announced, "I have invited one of these people to demonstrate their supposed talents. A woman who claims to be an exceptional pianist, despite her evident current situation." Laughter began to bubble among some guests. Senator Carrington leaned toward Marcus Rothstein. "Is he going to bring some vagrant to play the piano?" he whispered. "Typical Richard." "It'll be entertaining," Rothstein replied. "Reminds me of those television shows where they humiliate people for ratings." Richard raised a hand asking for silence. "Now, please give a warm welcome to our guest artist." He walked toward the service entrance and returned accompanied by a figure that contrasted violently with the surrounding luxury. Margaret Sullivan was 82 years old, though life's hardships on the streets made her appear even older. Her silver-gray hair, once thick and lustrous, now hung in thin strands around a face lined with wrinkles that told stories of pain and resistance. Her blue eyes, though faded with age, maintained an unshakable dignity that no adversity had managed to extinguish. She wore a wool coat that had seen better days, carefully mended in several places. Her shoes, obviously second-hand, had been polished with care until they shone as much as they could. In her trembling hands, she held a small cloth bag containing all her worldly possessions. The contrast was devastating. At one end of the salon, the most obscene wealth imaginable. At the other, absolute poverty. And in the center, Richard Blackwood, enjoying the spectacle he had orchestrated. The murmurs began immediately. "What the hell is that vagrant doing here? Has Richard lost his mind? Someone should call security. This is degrading for all of us." Margaret walked slowly toward the center of the salon, each step measured and deliberate. Despite her appearance, there was something in her posture that spoke of lost elegance, a grace that poverty had not completely destroyed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced theatrically, "allow me to present Margaret Sullivan, who personally assured me that she is a world-renowned pianist." Laughter erupted throughout the salon. Victoria Ashworth covered her mouth with her silk fan, her eyes dancing with cruelty. "Oh, Richard," she exclaimed between laughs. "You're terribly wicked." Senator Carrington didn't bother to hide his amusement. "Do you seriously expect us to believe that this person can play anything more than an empty can?" Margaret remained motionless in the center of the salon, surrounded by the circle of wealth and privilege. Her eyes swept over the faces looking at her with contempt, mockery, and disgust. But there was no pleading in her gaze, no desperation. Only a deep calm that disturbed those who observed her more carefully. "Mrs. Sullivan," Richard continued, savoring each syllable, "found me a few weeks ago in the park where she resides, and begged me for the opportunity to demonstrate her talent. Naturally, being a generous man, I decided to give her this unique opportunity." More laughter. Some guests began taking out their phones, anticipating a viral video of the humiliation about to unfold. Harrison, still watching from a distance, felt a knot in his stomach. In all his years of service, he had seen Richard humiliate business partners, employees, and even occasional guests who had fallen from grace. But this was different. This was pure cruelty directed at someone who had no way to defend herself. "Now," Richard continued, gesturing toward the Steinway piano, "our talented artist is going to delight our cultivated ears with her interpretation. I hope you appreciate the irony of the situation, a vagrant playing an instrument worth more than any house she could have ever lived in." Margaret approached the piano slowly. Her arthritic fingers brushed the polished surface of the instrument, and for a moment, something changed in her expression. It was as if she were remembering something distant and precious. "Come on," someone shouted from the back. "We don't have all night." "Surely she knows how to play chopsticks," added another, provoking more laughter. Richard walked around the piano, his presence dominating the space like a malevolent orchestra conductor. "Before we begin," he announced, "I would like you all to fully appreciate what you're about to witness. This piano, a 1962 Steinway Model D, has been played by some of the world's most renowned pianists. Van Cliburn played it at a private gala. Martha Argerich gave a recital here 5 years ago. And now," he paused dramatically, his eyes gleaming with malice, "and now, a homeless woman is going to profane this sacred instrument with her interpretation." Guffaws filled the salon. Some guests applauded sarcastically. Victoria Ashworth was practically doubled over with laughter. "Oh, Richard," she gasped. "You're absolutely diabolical. I love it." Margaret sat at the piano bench, adjusting her position carefully. Her hands rested on the keys, and for a moment, the salon fell into relative silence, expectant. "Go ahead," Richard mocked. "Show us that exceptional talent you boast so much about." The guests moved closer, forming a semicircle around the piano like vultures waiting for carrion. Their faces showed a mixture of cruel anticipation and barely contained disgust. David Chen was recording with his phone, murmuring to his companion, "This is going to be viral. A vagrant trying to play a Steinway. It's perfect." Sophia Marin adjusted her diamond necklace, preparing for the spectacle. "Poor thing," she said with false compassion. "She has no idea how ridiculous she looks." Senator Carrington leaned toward Marcus Rothstein. "I bet she can't even play a basic scale." Richard really outdid himself this time. Harrison watched from his position near the entrance, feeling a mixture of horror and fascination. He had seen many cruelties over the years, but this seemed particularly sadistic, even by Richard's standards. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, her hands motionless on the keys. She seemed to be gathering strength, or perhaps remembering something deeply buried in her memory. "What is she waiting for?" someone shouted. "Play something." "Maybe she needs glasses," added another, provoking more laughter. Richard moved closer to the piano, leaning over Margaret with a smile that would have made the devil pale. "Come on, dear," he murmured with false sweetness. "Don't be shy. We're all waiting for your magnificent interpretation." Margaret opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard. For a moment, their gazes met, and something passed between them, something that made Richard instinctively step back. In Margaret's eyes was something he didn't expect, not fear, not pleading, not desperation. There was something that looked dangerously like recognition. But the moment passed, and Richard regained his cruel composure. "Go ahead," he said, his voice now with a sharper edge. "Show us why you deserve to be in the same space as this magnificent instrument." The guests pressed closer, their laughter becoming crueler, more bloodthirsty. They had come expecting high-class entertainment, and Richard was giving them something even better, a defenseless victim to tear apart. Margaret turned her attention back to the keyboard. Her fingers, trembling slightly from arthritis and perhaps emotion, positioned themselves on the keys. The salon fell into expectant silence, 120 pairs of cruel eyes fixed on the elderly homeless woman who was about to humiliate herself before Los Angeles' elite. Richard smiled, savoring the moment. This was the kind of power he enjoyed most, the power to create and destroy, to elevate and humiliate, to be the cruel god in his own Olympus of marble and gold. "Whenever you're ready," he murmured. We have all the time in the world. And Margaret, with a dignity that contrasted violently with everything surrounding her, finally set her fingers in motion. Chapter 2, The Revelation. The first chords emerged from the piano like whispers from a lost world. Margaret had closed her eyes, and her fingers found the keys with a precision that made the salon's air thick and electric. What emerged was not the clumsy, discordant sound everyone expected, but the opening chords of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, performed with a technique that cut through the air like a crystal sword. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the cruel expectation of humiliation, but the stunned silence of 120 people who had just witnessed something impossible. The music flowed from the Steinway with a purity that seemed to cleanse the air poisoned with malice. Each note was placed with mathematical precision, but more than that, with an emotiveness that brought tears involuntarily to the eyes of those who listened. Victoria Ashworth was the first to drop her glass. The crystal shattered against the marble, but no one moved to collect the fragments. Everyone was hypnotized by the music flowing from the hands of the elderly homeless woman. Richard felt as if the ground was moving beneath his feet. This wasn't possible. This vagrant, this woman he had found sleeping on a park bench, couldn't be playing Chopin with the mastery of a professional concert artist. But the music continued, and now Margaret had abandoned the ballade to venture into the even more treacherous territory of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Her fingers danced over the keys with an authority that spoke of decades of training, of an entire life dedicated to the instrument. Senator Carrington had visibly paled. His musical knowledge was limited, but he had attended enough concerts at Walt Disney Concert Hall to recognize a masterful performance when he heard one. "This is impossible," he murmured to Marcus Rothstein. "A vagrant can't play like this." But Marcus didn't respond. The film director, who had worked with Hollywood's finest composers, was completely absorbed in the music. He recognized not only the impeccable technique, but something deeper, the soul of a true artist. Sophia Marin had stopped recording with her phone. Her hands trembled, not from cruel excitement, but from something she hadn't felt in years, genuine respect for pure talent. David Chen, the tech entrepreneur who had planned to upload a viral video of Humiliation, now struggled with the understanding that he had been about to become complicit in something monstrous. The music transformed again, this time to Debussy's delicate but technically challenging Etudes. Margaret's hands, which moments before had seemed fragile and trembling, now moved with the fluidity of water, each finger independent and perfectly controlled. Harrison, from his position near the entrance, felt tears streaming down his cheeks. In all his years of service, he had heard many pianists play that instrument, but he had never experienced anything like this. The music didn't just fill the salon, it transformed it. Richard began to slowly retreat, as if the music were a physical force pushing him back. Something in those melodies was painfully familiar, like a memory buried so deeply he had forgotten it existed. The final notes of Debussy's Etude faded into the air, but Margaret didn't stop. Without pause, she ventured into even more personal territory, an interpretation of Clair de Lune that seemed extracted directly from her soul. This time, the music had a different quality. There was melancholy in every note, a sense of loss so deep that some guests began to sob openly. It wasn't just technique they were hearing. It was the heart of someone who had loved deeply and lost everything. Victoria Ashworth had removed her silk gloves and was wiping tears with the back of her hand, ruining her $500 makeup. For the first time in decades, she had completely forgotten her appearance. Senator Carrington had sat heavily in one of the golden chairs, his face in his hands. The music had awakened memories of his own mother, a simple woman who had worked 3 jobs to pay for his education and who had died without seeing his political success. But the most affected was Richard. As the music continued, fragments of memory began to emerge from the depths of his mind like bubbles rising to the surface of a dark lake. A young woman sitting at the piano in a modest room, her fingers dancing over yellowed keys while a small boy listened from the sofa. A sweet voice singing a lullaby while delicate hands caressed blonde hair. Piano lessons in the afternoons, infinite patience while small fingers struggled to find the right keys. Richard shook his head violently, trying to disperse the images. But the music continued, relentless, unearthing memories he had spent decades burying. Margaret finished Clair de Lune and, without pause, began something that made Richard's world collapse completely, a melancholy and heartbreaking version of Happy Birthday, but performed with such mastery and emotion that it sounded like a requiem. But it wasn't just any version of Happy Birthday. It was a specific version, with ornaments and variations that Richard remembered hearing only once in his life, over 40 years ago, on his 10th birthday. The memories came like an avalanche. His mother, Margaret Sullivan Blackwood, sitting at the grand piano in the family home, playing a special version of Happy Birthday that she had arranged specifically for him. Her eyes shining with love as he blew out his cake candles. Her hands teaching him his first scales. Her voice telling him that music was the language of the soul. And then, years later, when arthritis began to affect her hands. The expensive medical treatments. The fights between his parents about money. His father, cruel and pragmatic, throwing her out of the house when she could no longer maintain her career as a concert pianist. The divorce. The custody battle that he had won. And Richard, influenced by his father's poisonous words, believing that his mother had abandoned them. Believing that she had chosen her failed career over her family. Building walls of resentment that had become so high he had forgotten what was behind them. When he turned 18, he had changed the locks on all the family properties. When his father died and he inherited the fortune, he had hired private investigators to ensure his mother could never claim anything. He had built his empire on the foundation that he was alone in the world, that he owed nothing to anyone. But now, hearing that music, those specific memories, those variations that only one person in the world knew. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's not possible. Margaret finished the piece and slowly lifted her hands from the keyboard. For the first time since she had begun playing, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard. And in that moment, he knew. The faded blue eyes were the same ones he remembered from his childhood. The same blue he had seen fill with tears when his father had thrown her out of the house. The same blue he had searched for in windows for years after the divorce, secretly hoping she would return. But there was something more in those eyes now. It wasn't pleading or desperation. It was recognition. And forgiveness. "Hello, Richard," Margaret said softly, each word falling into the salon's silence like stones into a deep well. The salon remained in absolute silence. The guests seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. Some had begun to understand that they were witnessing something much deeper than a simple humiliation spectacle. Richard staggered backward, seeking support against the wall. His face had lost all color, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. "Mom." The word came out like a broken sigh. Victoria Ashworth let out a choked moan. Senator Carrington had stood up, his expression showing dawning horror and understanding. Margaret rose slowly from the piano bench, her movements dignified despite her worn clothes. She walked toward Richard, each step measured and careful. 30 years ago, she said, her voice clear and strong in the silence, I was Margaret Sullivan Blackwood. First pianist of the Los Angeles Philharmonic for 20 years. Mother of Richard Blackwood. The words resonated in the salon like funeral bells. Some guests began to retreat, understanding that they had been witnesses and accomplices to something horrible. When arthritis began to affect my hands, Margaret continued, I could no longer maintain the level my career demanded. Medical treatments depleted our savings. Your father decided that a disabled wife was an obstacle to his social and financial ambitions. Richard wanted to speak, but words choked in his throat. Tears he hadn't shed in decades began to run down his cheeks. I searched for you for years after the divorce, Margaret continued. But your father had filled your mind with lies about me. And when he died and you inherited everything, you changed the locks. You hired lawyers to ensure I could never claim anything that had been my home. Richard's tears had become sobs. Some guests began to leave discreetly, uncomfortable with the intensity of the scene unfolding before them. All these years. Richard managed to whisper. I thought. Dad told me that I had left voluntarily, Margaret finished. That I had chosen my career over my family. That you didn't matter to me. Richard nodded, unable to speak. But I never stopped playing Happy Birthday for you every year on your birthday, Margaret said. Even if it was in public parks, even if it was on street benches. Even though you never knew it. Harrison had approached, his own tears flowing freely. In all his years of service, he had seen Richard build his empire on the foundation that he was alone in the world, that he had no family to love him. Mr. Richard, Harrison murmured. All these years, she's been here, in Los Angeles. Richard looked at his butler with glassy eyes. You knew. Harrison shook his head. I didn't know who she was. But I've seen her in the park near here for the past few years. Sometimes I heard her playing melodies on a small portable keyboard. It was beautiful, but I never thought. Margaret moved closer to Richard, now only steps away. I've lived on the streets for 5 years, son, she said softly. When my small pension ran out and I couldn't pay rent anymore. Sometimes I played in the subway for coins. Sometimes in public parks. Always hoping that someday, somehow, you would recognize me. Richard collapsed into a chair, his body convulsing with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. My God, he managed to say through tears. My God, what have I done? The last guests had left the salon, leaving only Richard, Margaret, and Harrison. The silence now was different, not tense or expectant, but sacred, like the interior of a cathedral. Margaret approached her son and, with infinite tenderness, placed her trembling hand on his head, as she used to do when he was a child and had nightmares. "You're still my little boy," she whispered. "You'll always be my little boy." Richard looked up at his mother, truly seeing her face for the first time in decades. The wrinkles, the marks of time and adversity, but also the same kindness he remembered from his childhood. "I searched for you," he murmured. "After Dad died, I hired investigators. But they told me that you had died." Margaret smiled sadly. "When you lose everything, when you live on the streets, you become invisible to the world. Especially to the world of the rich. Private investigators don't look in homeless shelters or under bridges." Richard stood up abruptly, taking his mother's hands in his. "I'm going to fix this," he said, his voice broken but determined. "I'm going to fix everything. The house, the money, the lost years." But Margaret shook her head gently. "It's not about money, Richard. It was never about money." "Then what is it about?" Margaret looked around the opulent salon, at the remains of the cruel party that had been interrupted by truth. "It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you to be cruel. It's about remembering the child who used to sit by the piano and listen to music for hours. It's about remembering that love is more valuable than all the gold in the world." Richard followed her gaze, seeing his mansion for the first time not as a symbol of power, but as a golden prison he had built around his heart. "I've wasted my life," he whispered. "I've hurt so many people. I've built my fortune on others' suffering." "But it's not too late," Margaret said. "It's never too late to start over." Mother and son embraced in the center of the salon, surrounded by the echoes of music that had broken decades of separation and resentment. The Steinway piano remained silent now, but its voice had changed two lives forever. Harrison watched from a distance, smiling through his tears. In all his years of service, he had never seen anything as beautiful as the reconciliation he had just witnessed. "Come home with me," Richard said, his voice still broken. "Please. Let me take care of you as I should have all these years." Margaret nodded, but there was something more in her eyes. "Only if you promise something, Richard. Anything. Promise me you'll use your fortune to help others like me. Promise me you'll remember that every homeless person has a story, a family, broken dreams that maybe can be repaired." Richard nodded vigorously. "I promise. Everything I have, everything I am, I'll put it in service of fixing the damage I've caused." Margaret smiled, and for the first time in decades, Richard saw in her face a glimpse of the young, beautiful woman who had been his mother. "Then play for me one more time," Richard asked. "Play something beautiful." Margaret returned to the piano and sat once more at the bench. This time, she chose a different piece, Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, a simple but deeply emotional melody that filled the salon with a sense of peace and hope. As the music flowed, Richard approached the piano and sat on the floor next to the bench, as he used to do when he was a child. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember not just what he had lost, but what he had just recovered. The music continued, and with each note, the marble and gold walls of the mansion seemed to become less important. What mattered was there, in that moment, a mother and her son, reunited by the power of music and love. When the last notes faded away, Richard knew his life had changed forever. The cruel millionaire who had organized the humiliation had died in that room. In his place, a man had been born who finally understood the true value of wealth. It wasn't in banks or properties. It was in his mother's arms, in the promise of redemption, and in the music that connected their hearts across all the lost years. That night, Richard Blackwood's mansion fell silent, but it was a different silence. It wasn't the emptiness of loneliness, but the quietude of peace. And in that quietude, the echoes of the most beautiful music continued to resonate, promising that tomorrow would be the first day of a completely new life. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of what had once been Richard Blackwood's opulent dining room. The massive crystal chandelier was gone, replaced by simple pendant lights. The gilded furniture had been donated, and in its place stood long wooden tables where dozens of people sat sharing breakfast. Margaret Sullivan Blackwood, now wearing a simple but elegant blue dress, moved gracefully between the tables, her hands no longer trembling as they once had. Proper nutrition, medical care, and most importantly, love, had restored much of her strength. She paused to speak with an elderly man who reminded her of her own journey from the streets to this moment. "The scrambled eggs are delicious, Mrs. Margaret," said Rosa Martinez, a woman in her 40s who had lost her apartment when Richard's former company had demolished her building. "My children haven't eaten this well in months." Margaret smiled, placing a gentle hand on Rosa's shoulder. "This is your home now, Rosa. For as long as you need it." The Blackwood mansion had been transformed into the Margaret Sullivan Center for Housing and Arts, the largest homeless shelter and rehabilitation center on the West Coast. What had once been a monument to greed and ostentation was now a beacon of hope for those who had been forgotten by society. Richard emerged from what had been his private study, now converted into an office where he worked 16-hour days managing the foundation's operations. He looked different, thinner, with genuine warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there in decades. He wore simple clothes, having sold most of his expensive wardrobe to fund the center's programs. "Mom," he called softly, approaching Margaret. "The morning meeting is about to start." She nodded, but first turned to address the room. "Friends, my son Richard has an announcement to make." The conversations gradually quieted. Richard stepped forward, still uncomfortable being the center of attention in this new context, but determined to continue the work of redemption. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "First, I want to thank you all for the trust you've placed in us over these past months. The Margaret Sullivan Center has become more than a shelter, it's become a community." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Children who had been living in cars now played safely in the mansion's former ballroom, converted into a childcare center. Adults who had lost hope were learning new skills in workshops held in the renovated guest rooms. "Today, I have several announcements," Richard continued. "First, the Los Angeles City Council has approved our proposal to purchase and convert 12 additional properties into affordable housing. These won't be temporary shelters, but permanent homes where families can rebuild their lives." Applause filled the room. Rosa Martinez wiped away tears, thinking of a real apartment where her children could have their own rooms. Second, Richard's voice grew stronger, "We're launching the Margaret Sullivan Music Academy. Professional musicians will teach music to anyone who wants to learn, regardless of their background or financial situation. Because we've learned that art and beauty aren't luxuries, they're necessities for the human spirit." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of pride. Her son had truly understood the lesson that poverty had taught them both. "And finally," Richard said, his voice softening, "I want to tell you about a letter we received yesterday." He pulled out an envelope from his pocket. "It's from Harrison, our former butler, who now works at the center full-time. He wrote to tell us that his granddaughter, who has been taking piano lessons here, won first place in the regional youth music competition." The applause was thunderous. Harrison, now in his 70s but more energetic than he'd been in years, stood up with tears in his eyes. "She said she wanted to play like Mrs. Margaret," he called out. "She said music could change the world." Margaret approached the piano that still occupied the center of what had been the main salon. It was the same Steinway, but its purpose had been transformed. Where once it had been a symbol of intimidation and exclusion, it was now the heart of healing and community. "Would you like me to play something?" Margaret asked the room. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Children gathered around the piano bench, adults stopped their conversations, and the room filled with expectant quiet. Margaret began to play Chopin's Minute Waltz, but her interpretation was different from that night 6 months ago. Where there had once been pain and longing, now there was joy and hope. The music danced through the air, carrying with it the promise that broken things could be made beautiful again. As she played, Richard noticed something that made his heart swell. Standing near the back of the room was Victoria Ashworth, but she looked nothing like the cruel socialite who had mocked his mother that terrible night. She wore simple clothes and had a warm smile as she helped serve breakfast to the children. After Margaret's confrontation with her son, Victoria had undergone her own transformation. The shame of what she had witnessed, and Margaret's gracious forgiveness when they met again weeks later, had awakened something in Victoria that had been dormant for decades, her humanity. "Richard," Victoria approached him as the music continued. "The donors' meeting is scheduled for this afternoon. We've raised another $2 million for the affordable housing project." Richard shook his head in amazement. Many of the people who had been present that night had experienced their own awakenings. Senator Carrington had sponsored legislation to protect tenants from predatory evictions. Marcus Rothstein was producing a documentary about homelessness. Even David Chen had redirected his tech company's resources toward developing apps that helped homeless individuals access services. But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationship between mother and son. They had spent countless hours talking, sharing memories, and filling in the gaps of 30 lost years. Richard had learned about his mother's struggles, her small triumphs, and the ways she had maintained hope even in the darkest moments. Margaret had learned about the lonely child her son had become, how his father's poison had twisted his understanding of love and success, and how the walls he had built to protect himself had become a prison that kept out everything good in life. "There's something I want to show you," Margaret said to Richard as the breakfast gathering began to disperse. She led him to a small room that had once been a storage closet but was now her private studio. On a simple desk sat dozens of handwritten letters. "These arrive every day," she explained. "From people who heard our story, from families who've been helped by the center, from musicians who want to volunteer their time." Richard picked up one of the letters and read, "Dear Mrs. Margaret, I'm a single mother with 2 children. We lost our apartment last year and have been living in our car. When I heard about your center on the news, I thought it was too good to be true. But you not only gave us a place to stay, you gave us hope. My daughter has started piano lessons and says she wants to be just like you when she grows up. Thank you for showing us that kindness still exists in the world." Richard's eyes filled with tears as he read. Each letter represented a life touched, a family helped, a future made brighter. "You know what the most beautiful part is?" Margaret asked. "These people don't write to thank us for our charity. They write to thank us for seeing them as human beings worthy of dignity and respect." Richard nodded, understanding completely. The mansion had once been a place where the wealthy came to feel superior to others. Now it was a place where everyone was valued for their humanity, not their bank account. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, peeked in shyly. "Mrs. Margaret? Could you help me with the piece I'm practicing? I can't get the fingering right on the difficult part." Margaret's face lit up. "Of course, Sophie. Let's go to the piano." As they walked toward the main room, Sophie chattered excitedly. "My mom says that before we came here, she had forgotten how to smile. But now she smiles every day. She says it's because of the music." Richard watched his mother sit with the child at the piano, patiently guiding her small fingers over the keys. The scene was so reminiscent of his own childhood lessons that for a moment, time seemed to fold in on itself. But this was better than his childhood memories. This was love multiplied, shared with everyone who needed it. The piano that had once been an instrument of humiliation had become a source of healing for dozens of people. "Mr. Richard?" Sophie called to him. "Would you like to learn piano too? Mrs. Margaret could teach you. She's the best teacher in the whole world." Richard smiled, remembering the lessons he had abandoned decades ago when his heart had hardened. "I think I'd like that very much, Sophie." As evening approached, Richard found himself walking through the halls of what had once been his monument to greed. In the former wine cellar, support groups met to help people overcome addiction and trauma. In the basement gym, formerly his private fitness center, families exercised together and children played safely. The guest bedrooms housed families working to get back on their feet. The library had become a study center where adults earned their GEDs and children did homework with volunteer tutors. Even the formal gardens had been converted into vegetable plots where residents grew fresh food for the center's kitchen. Every space that had once served only Richard's ego now served the community's needs. He paused in front of a photograph hanging in what had been the main hallway. It showed his mother on the night of the benefit concert they had organized 2 months earlier. She was at the piano, surrounded by a diverse group of people, former homeless individuals, reformed socialites, politicians, artists, and children, all singing together. The concert had raised $5 million, but more importantly, it had shown the world that transformation was possible. That people could change, that communities could heal, and that music truly was a universal language that connected all hearts. "Admiring our family portrait?" Margaret approached, her voice warm with affection. "I keep thinking about that night," Richard said. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that my life would look like this, I would have thought they were insane. And yet here we are," Margaret replied, linking her arm through his. "Proof that it's never too late to become who we were meant to be." They stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their unusual household settling in for the evening. Children's laughter echoed from the former ballroom. Adults discussed their job search progress in the converted study. Someone was practicing violin in one of the upstairs rooms. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked quietly. "All those years you lost because of my selfishness?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain we both carried," she said finally. "But I don't regret the journey that brought us here. If we hadn't both experienced loss and emptiness, we might never have understood the true value of what we've built together." Richard nodded, understanding that their shared brokenness had become the foundation for something far more beautiful than his former wealth could have ever purchased. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small, worn photograph. I carried this with me every day for 30 years. Richard looked at the picture and saw himself at age 10, sitting at their old family piano, his mother's hands guiding his on the keys. Both of them were smiling with pure joy. I always believed we would find our way back to each other, Margaret said. Music taught me that broken melodies can be made whole again, that discordant notes can resolve into harmony. Richard took the photograph with trembling hands. May I keep this? It's yours, Margaret said. Just as you've always been mine. As they walked toward the main salon for their nightly family gathering, as they now called the evening time when everyone in the center came together, Richard felt something he had never experienced in all his years of wealth and power: complete peace. The salon filled with the diverse community they had built together. Former enemies sat next to each other as friends. Children who had known only uncertainty now played with the confidence of those who feel truly safe. Adults who had been invisible to society were now valued members of a family. Margaret took her place at the piano, and gradually, the room quieted in anticipation of their evening tradition. She began to play a simple melody, one that everyone in the center had learned to sing together. We are family, bound not by blood alone, but by the love that makes this house a home. From broken pieces, we've built something new, a place where everyone's dreams can come true. The voices rose together, young and old, experienced and struggling, wealthy former socialites and people still rebuilding their lives. They were united not by their circumstances, but by their shared humanity and the understanding that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and love. As the song ended, Richard stood up to speak, as had become his tradition. 6 months ago, this house was filled with beautiful objects but empty of love, he said. Today, it's filled with love, and that makes everything in it beautiful. He looked directly at his mother. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we write the future. And I choose to write it with all of you. The applause was warm and heartfelt. Children ran to hug Richard and Margaret. Adults shook hands and made plans for tomorrow's activities. The former mansion buzzed with the energy of a true community. Later that night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, Richard and Margaret sat together at the piano one last time. Play our song, Richard requested softly. Margaret smiled and began the special arrangement of Happy Birthday that had revealed their connection 6 months earlier. But now the melody held no sadness, only joy for the second chance they had been given. Thank you, Richard whispered as the last notes faded. For what? For never giving up on me. For seeing the person I could become even when I had forgotten him completely. Margaret reached over and took her son's hand. That's what love does, Richard. It sees the truth even when it's buried under years of pain and mistakes. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found their way back to each other and, in doing so, had discovered how to help others find their way home too. Outside, the lights of Los Angeles twinkled as they always had, but inside the Margaret Sullivan Center, something new existed, a place where brokenness was healed, where the forgotten were remembered, and where the power of love and music continued to transform lives every single day. The piano that had once been an instrument of cruelty had become a symbol of redemption. The mansion that had once isolated its owner from humanity had become a bridge connecting people across all the barriers that usually divided them. And in that transformation, Richard and Margaret had learned the most important lesson of all, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the number of lives you touch, the hope you restore, and the love you share with the world. As they finally headed upstairs to their respective rooms, Margaret in what had been the master suite, Richard in a simple former guest room, they passed the framed quote that now hung where Richard's portrait had once been. Music has the power to heal the world, one heart at a time. When we play together, we remember that we are all part of the same beautiful symphony. Margaret Sullivan Blackwood. The next morning would bring new challenges, new families to help, new lives to transform. But it would also bring new possibilities, new hope, and new proof that the most beautiful music comes not from perfect instruments, but from hearts that have learned to play in harmony with others. The piano of memory had done its work. It had revealed the truth, healed the broken, and shown that even the most discordant life can be rewritten into something beautiful. And the music played on.